let's talk about political messaging. Joining me now is DPR and Co-Advertising co-founder Richard Ralphsmith. Richard, the major parties have already started ramping up their ad campaigns ahead of the upcoming election, and both parties seem to be focused on extending their reach on social media. Here's what Labor's pushing.
These are all cost of living measures introduced by the federal Labor government because we understand the pressure families are under, and every little bit helps. But look who was opposed to every single one of them. Whichever way you look at it, you'll be worse off under Dutton.
It may be a little bit boring, but I think that's actually a pretty effective ad. It's focused on cost of living, it's simple, easy to understand.
Yeah, it is. It's simple and it's clear. Whether it's going to be effective, I'm not entirely sure. We know cost of living is the biggest issue in the election, but when you look at the big cost of living issues, housing, food and energy, that ad doesn't really touch the first two, and then the third one has been Labor's biggest broken promise, and it puts the emphasis on that. So I do wonder whether people look at it and go, right, you've given me $300 as a handout, but does that really compensate for the massive increase in my energy bills? So I wonder about its effectiveness from that point of view. Well, time will tell. And I also wonder whether or not we're seeing very early, is Labor going to make the same mistake by demonising or over-demonising, it's a very Dutton-focused ad, a Conservative leader from the Liberal side? Because every time they've done that, Howard, Abbott, now Dutton, it has backfired.
Now let's contrast that Labor commercial with what the Liberals have got.
Sometimes we were the only thing between vulnerable people and serious harm. So I learned the importance of always turning up and getting on with the job. Later, I started a small family business. It grew to 40 staff who had families, mortgages and aspirations, which means that you are relied on to balance the books and be responsible.
Peter Dutton in that ad talks about being a police officer, small business owner, talks about his time as a government minister in the full ad. How effective is that?
Well, it is. It's a solid effort at humanising Dutton, showing him as a police officer, showing him as a family man, showing him interacting with people in the electorate, with John Howard in particular as well. It's pretty stock standard playbook stuff to humanise an opposition leader when people aren't really familiar with the person. I think what they really need to do with him is get bolder as the campaign progresses, both in policy but also as in communications.
Well, I fear they're a little bit scared to be bold because they're in striking range. I think they're worried about making a mistake and having some sort of a backlash. Now, what have you observed in terms of how political parties have changed their ad spending? Obviously, the focus isn't just on television and print anymore. You've got a lot of online ads. You've got a lot of ads on social media. How do they manage those competing concerns?
Well, certainly print has dropped off, although when you do a print buy, you're always buying the digital package as well. But if you consider TV in terms of, TV streaming video and catch-up video and then online video, all of that in a package, Steve, that is still the bulk of the media spend for both parties, and it's the quickest and most effective way to get to the mass audience quickly. And we also know that every TV ad, every new TV ad is picked up by the news media, and that's the way most people interact with it, and that's free. So they know that that's what sets the agenda, and they will still be putting the money behind that. But having said that, social media spend in this election will be the highest we've ever seen. It will be increasing.
And that's what you said about being bolder, because if you do have a bold ad, you are going to get that free publicity. The TV programs are going to play it, people are going to write about it. But do we see those bold ads in Australia? It seems to not be such a feature here.
We're certainly not as polarised as they are in America, where the whole game is, with voluntary voting, charging up the base. But we will, certainly on the Liberal side, sure, the polls are very, very close, but the Liberals have a mountain to climb, right? And if you look at what Dutton has done so far to get himself in the position that he's in, he's done it by being bold, making bold calls, primarily on the voice and on nuclear power. Wherever you stand on them, that's what's put him in this position today. he should take a cue from that, and the Liberals should take a cue from that. That boldness is the way to go.
The two really divisive, you could say, polarising positions he's taken are the reasons he is in this position.
And I'd even be
You should be advising him instead of some of his inner circle who I think are telling him to play it safe. I think this is why we're seeing him kind of step back from those
days. It's very early days. He ought to go bolder. And I'd be raising the spectre of minority government. You know, everybody knows what a nightmare it was in 2010 with minority government. I would be saying, imagine, if you don't like the way Labor is going, imagine Labor minority supported by the Greens. Raise that spectre and then put out policies there to really energise people and be bold. I think that's the strategy to go for the Liberals.
That sounds like an absolutely brilliant idea, because the Greens have become so radical, and it is entirely possible, in fact, many say it's likely that we're going to have a Labor minority government with the Greens. And given their stance over the recent years, everything from their crazy economic policies to their attitude to Israel, that would be frightening for so many people. So that could be a really powerful campaign if the Liberals get that right. Yeah. Now, we've also seen a lot of attention on social media, trying to reach younger voters through Instagram and TikTok. Let's look at this effort from Ministers Chris Bowen and Tanya Plibersek.
Nuclear uses 40% more water than even coal.
Yeah, and not only is it 40%, but for Peter Dutton to do his nuclear plan, you'd actually need this much water.
Yeah, because he says they're going to get a lot more electricity out of nuclear than we currently get out of coal. And when you put that together with nuclear needing more water, that means they will need a lot of water. And this isn't enough.
I just don't think they do these well, both Labor and Liberal. I see very few ads on that platform where I think, this one hits the mark. What do you think about that? Is that speaking to the converted? Is it going to convince undecided voters?
I don't think it'll convince a single undecided, but if you have a look at the comments section of that ad, it gets pretty negative. But look, yes, of course, Instagram does skew younger than mainstream TV, and they're obviously trying to do that. But does it really skew play school young? You know, it's like they're in kids' chairs pouring water out to try to make this really quite simple point, which I don't think is the main game anyway when it comes to nuclear energy. So I think it's probably going to be seen as a little patronising. And yes, you're right, that they feel a little bit uncomfortable in the social media area. TikTok in particular, Labor, are really, really uncomfortable if you have a look at what they're doing. But yeah, they're trying to be the cool kid when they're not the cool kid. It's much better to embrace your weakness and be yourself, which is what Dutton is, strangely enough, doing quite well on TikTok.
Yeah, he's got a bit of a following on TikTok, which is surprising.
Yep.
Now, before you go, we've got to touch on Clive Palmer. He tends to spend a lot of money on these campaigns. He's now bankrolling a new political party called the Trumpet of Patriots, which is supposed to mirror Donald Trump's policies, but I just think it's such an absurd name, Trumpet of Patriots. I mean, why wouldn't you just go for something simple like Make Australia Great Again or Make Albo Go Away? That still says MAGA. Yeah. Something a bit more, I don't know, this seems like a satire.
It's complicated, isn't it? Like, I can't even remember. I've got to read, what was it? Trumpet for Patriots? Every time I hear it, I've got to try to remember it again. He has done billboards with Make Australia Great Again.
Yeah, I've seen those, yes.
But what I think it does do, though, is that it stymies Labor's attempts to paint Peter Dutton as Donald Trump, because the Donald Trump in this election is Clive Palmer, right? It makes Peter Dutton look mild, moderate, considered, and I think that could be a real positive for...
That's not a bad point as well, because our media has just been so utterly deranged in covering anything to do with Donald Trump. So there is this real negative connotation, and Labor have tried to paint Dutton as Trump. So if you do have an actual
Trump
big
figure,
larger than life, who's saying I'm Australia's Donald Trump, then that's can only work for Peter Dutton. Fascinating. Richard Ralph Smith, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thanks again, Rita.